Hi, everybody. International Master David Pruess here, and it has been a long time. It's been a really long time since I did a chess video. It's also been a really long time since I played a chess game. And I played in the US Chess League last night. That was my first game back after a really long time. And I think my previous game was in the US Chess League last year. So very long time, and one of the focuses of what I want to talk about as we go over this game today is I want to talk about what it's like to play when you're rusty. One question that people often have about rust is how long does it take to become rusty? And in my opinion, it usually takes 6 to 8 weeks for a tournament chess player to become rusty. And by rusty, it's meant not in the habit of playing, and therefore there are some things that are off about how you play. And we're going to discuss what those are a little bit, as well as how to deal with them. The main thing when you're rusty, the main thing that goes is time management, calculation, and confidence. I think those are the main things. So time management, one of the big things there is basically when you've been playing a lot of tournament games, you get a sense of when you've thought long enough and you should make a move. Like you're thinking about a move. You don't know for sure what the best move is, right? You're trying to think ahead some amount, pick the right move. At some point, your mind tells you, well, we've thought about this long enough. This is the way to go. Or good enough, let's make this choice. And it cuts you off. And the way it does that is based on this incredibly subconscious calculation of when and how to use your time that's based on having played hundreds of other games and sort of slowly calibrated to that. It's very seldom based on a conscious calculation of somebody saying, like, I have this many minutes, this is how important this decision is, this is how important that decision is, this decision is worth 10 minutes, this decision is worth 2 minutes, I have 80 minutes left, the position is X degrees complicated or only Y degrees complicated, so I can spend this much time on it, or I need to save this much time for later, or I don't need to save this much time. Very few chess players do that kind of calculation consciously. It's almost all subconscious, and it's a very delicate subconscious calibration which you get just from playing a lot. So when you're rusty, that goes out the window. So one big danger when you're rusty is that you'll make a decision too flippantly, or that you'll invest 30 minutes 40 minutes into some silly decision that you should just kind of make sooner, or that you normally would. The second thing that can go pretty frequently is calculation, and your speed will go down a bit, and also your thoroughness, just catching all the possible moves, noticing what your opponent's candidate moves are and what your candidate moves are on the first 2 to 3 moves of a variation. It's just gonna drop off. You'll just miss some random moves, or you'll take a long time before you're like, oh yeah, or they could do that. Well, there goes that idea. Let me look for a different idea. That's the second one. And then the third one is confidence. And this one is a kind of a mix of the first two. It's like the way it manifests is you're not calculating as well, which is true. So you should have a little bit less confidence. You are calculating less well. And then you also don't really know how to manage your time. So what I think happens to most people when they're rusty is they start double checking everything they're thinking about. And this leads to like really bad time trouble. And then since you're not calculating as quickly, when you get into time trouble, you really can like blow games and like make like silly mistakes later on when you start really feeling that time pressure. So those are the biggest things. And well, I mean, there's not like an obvious remedy to these things. If you're just not calculating as well, what can you do? You're not going to calculate as well, right? And if you're not calibrated to manage your time, spending a lot of time figuring out consciously how much time you should be spending on your moves isn't going to help you that much either. So calibration is something you need to get back just by playing. So no way to deal with that in your first, couple games back. The calculation, that's something you can do a little bit about. And the way you do that is you just try and practice some calculation beforehand. So I didn't have a lot of time to get ready for this game. So what I did was like the most basic crash course to deal with some of your rust and like turn your basic calculation back on. And that is to do a bunch of tactical puzzles, especially simple, fast ones. Like sitting there and solving a really hard puzzle that's a real challenge for you that takes like 40 minutes to calculate all the variations through. That's not the kind of thing you're probably going to do successfully in your first couple tournament games back, nor the kind of thing you should be trying to do in your first couple games back. So I don't really see like a huge value in trying to work on that right away. But you are going to get into time pressure probably, and you're going to have to make some quick moves, and hopefully you're not going to make like 1 and 2 move blunders. So doing a bunch of easy tactics is a good way to get back, and I did that. So the last like 2 weeks, I've been doing just like masses of easy tactics. And then the second thing I did was play a bunch of blitz games, basically with the same goal, just to get some of my instincts back, see whether or not I'm missing really obvious tactics in blitz, and start trying to like turn on again that ability to be under pressure, seconds ticking, and try and see like 10 things in 1 second. Instead of sitting there dreamily and spending 10 seconds seeing one thing or 100 seconds seeing one thing, which is what you're apt to do when you come back rusty. So a bunch of blitz and tactics to try and deal with the calculation weakness that you would expect coming back. The third thing, confidence. Okay, I mean, it's bad to be overconfident. It's bad to be underconfident. Usually a little bit of optimism is better than complete neutrality, a little bit of extra belief in yourself. But, coming back rusty, I recommend being kind of like objective and realizing that there's a good chance you're missing some things. So I don't advocate not double checking. What I advocate is not quadruple checking. Because when I say you have a tendency to double check when you're rusty, it's actually a tendency to double check and then double check and then double check till you're like quadruple, pentuple checking every single little thing. That is like guaranteed time trouble and like blunders later on. So I think it's reasonable to double check, and I think you can't let yourself start quadruple checking. It's just not a realistic way to play a game, and you have to make some mistakes on your way to getting your skills back. So you can't take the approach of trying to be a perfectionist and avoid all mistakes. So that's my strongest piece of advice for anyone coming back from being rusty is, yes, you can double check. Please don't double check 4 times. All right. And with that, let's try and get over to this game and start looking at this in an actual context of an actual game in progress. All right, here we go. Here's the position. I'm black. I don't want to comment too much on the opening because I'm not that interested in openings. But this is certainly a line that I haven't really played before in any tournament game, I don't think, playing as black. Previously in the French defense, I would play like bishop e7 or, almost always bishop e7 in this position. So this d takes e4 variation simplifies the position a little bit. The plans are like pretty simple. Like this bishop obviously wants to go on the long diagonal. C5 is obviously your plan to try and neutralize white's central advantage. White can either castle kingside or castle queenside, which increases the sharpness or decreases the sharpness of the position. But, one of his main plans is to attack on the king side. The other is just to put rooks on the d file and just sort of sit around for a while with both sides maneuvering. So develop. He goes for queenside castling, increasing the sharpness of the position. In this position, I considered queen d5 followed by castling queenside. But finally, I just went with castling kingside, which is simpler. he instantly played king b1, which is what I'd anticipated, and now I played c5. This move obviously loses a pawn. And given how rusty I am, you might suspect that I did not even realize that it sacks a pawn. White can take the pawn, and you can't recapture on c5 because of bishop h7 check, losing the queen. But in fact, I was still good enough that I had seen this. C5 is a strategic idea. It's based on a strategy as well as partly being desperation in this position, because if you don't play c5, there are not a lot of great moves for black here. If you play a move like h6, white just plays h4, and you don't really want to take on g5 and open the h-file here. And white is going to start a kingside attack here pretty soon with some combination of h4 and maybe g4, etc. So you have to do something as black. There's not many good moves you could possibly play here. You could play a move like queen c8 trying to prepare c5, but queen c8's awkward, blocking in your rooks and leaving your bishop undefended. The other thing you could try would be knight d5, just trying to trade a piece. Though it's not a super desirable trade and it blocks the bishop. So c5 is partly like a desperation kind of thing, and white could take, but he didn't. And then the idea is black's going to move the queen off of the file, and white's going to potentially take and take back. So this is a pawn sacrifice, and the strategic idea it's based on is that if you are castled on opposite sides, the pawns on the side of the board where your opponent's king is are not worth much to you. You'd rather have open files than have those pawns. That's not 100% true, but the idea is if I could just take this pawn off the board, I probably would right here. In this case, if white could put a bishop on b3, that might be an example of a situation where you can't do as much with your two open files. There's obviously times where this is a good sacrifice and times where it's not, but that's the idea that it's based on. Just getting the open files, very likely to be worth a pawn. Okay. So that said, my opponent just continued with his kingside play in the game. So he played h4. And here I played queen c7 pretty quickly on principle, which is a good thing. I mean, you could think about trying to take on d4 here for a while if you wanted to. You could even consider, trading on f3 and then taking on d4. But just in principle, I didn't want to be improving his knight to here with pressure on e6 or knight f5 type moves. Like if queen c8, the knight could come to f5 in some case. If queen c7, the knight could go to b5. So this knight seems improved. I have to worry about knight e6. And now he can also play the move f3, which deadens these two pieces. So it just kind of like improves his position. My preference was not to do that. And I played this move, which seemed about correct, without wasting too much time on it. So that's good. Connects the rooks, and everything black's done is tending towards giving him a good position. So it's up to white to kind of refute my play tactically, which he now tried to do. So this is where the first challenge comes in the game. He took on f6, and I immediately went into basically desperation mode, because what I suddenly realized, because I'd played queen c7 without too much calculation, what I'd suddenly realized is that, oh yeah, he's already in position once he plays h4 to trade on f6 and play knight g5 with some serious threats. Basically looking like knight g5, threatening to take on h7. If you play h6, he still plays knight h7 with two threats, one to win in exchange, one to destroy my kingside position. Often knight h7 is bad because it gets trapped there, but here, since it's attacking two things, there's no way to leave it there. And if g6, his idea could be to take on h7, king takes h7, h5. This is kind of like you barely have to think about it, automatic sacrifice, right? You're getting, completely decimating the king's pawn cover, getting at least two pawns for white for the piece, leaving the king completely open. None of these pieces are really in defensive position. Looks extremely promising for white. Like, not a very high risk scenario. You would not expect that you could be losing or worse if you play this way as white. And in a practical game, you also know that the moves are going to be much harder for black to play than for white in this kind of position usually. So that's also a factor saying, hey, this is probably going to go well. So, so when he took on f6, I thought, uh-oh, we've already reached a critical moment. And I'd just been noticing how on board one we were losing in like 20 moves. And obviously I talked about low confidence being an issue in a first game back. I hadn't played in like 11 months. I played with Ruifeng a bit last year, and he was a good player. And then a couple days ago, I looked at a few of his games from the past year, and while I hadn't played at all, his games looked great. Like he was playing like basically, I would say to me, it looked like he was playing at a grandmaster level. So I'm like, oh my, I was thinking like, oh, I hope at least like I don't lose in 20 moves, like get my pieces out, and hopefully avoid any like instant like tacting. And once he took here, I was like, move 13, I could easily lose before move 20. So at first, I figured that allowing this knight h7 thing was going to be completely losing. And I calculated a few variations around it, like here, takes. I found that I could defend queen g4 with queen f7 with probably decent chances of survival, since queen h3, there's rook h8. So getting the queen to f7 seemed good. Another possibility was that he could grab the pawn on e6 first, and then on this move, kind of come over here. This way he's got two pawns and the king's more exposed to some other things. But the key move, which I realized, was actually he could try bishop takes g6. And once I saw this, I basically sort of jumped to the likely conclusion that the knight takes h7 sack would not just be promising, but would win instantly. The tactical point is that if you take, there's check here and mate. And then the backup tactical point is, well, that means you lost the g pawn. You've got no time to bring your queen over to the defense. So your opponent can play, queen g4 pretty soon and try and checkmate you. Additionally, white's threatening rook h7, winning your queen. So seems like a lot to try and deal with, right? So I was like, that's probably lost. And then I thought, okay, before I get really deep into that variation, let's just see what my other options are. My other options, because this is almost automatic, but I was like, well, if that's just losing, I need to consider like really what all my options are. And as I said, when you're rusty, it can be hard to come up with like a list of what your basic options are. But my basic options are, I could take with the g pawn instead, which at least keeps his knight from flying in to finish things off, right? The pawn on f6 will do a good job controlling that knight. Or I could go bishop f6, knight g5, 8 h6, knight h7, and now basically I was thinking, well, I could sack in exchange. I get his center pawn and a nice bishop pair, right? And we go to something like this. This is attacked. This is attacked. He doesn't have any attacking against my king. Position looks pretty solid, right? The problem with this is, I immediately saw he can go c3, just kicking the bishop to e5 or f6 or whatever, and then go bishop e4. And basically, he just takes away the diagonal from this bishop and basically trades it. I mean, I could hide on c8, which might be my best practical chance, but obviously is terrible. But if I trade, basically he has a simple plan of doubling rooks and playing rook d7 at some point. I mean, I would consider this position basically technically losing if your opponent plays well, and not very hard to play for white. So I had to say that realistically, even though like an exchange sack for a center pawn would be like a great way to bail out, it didn't look plausible here. Then I considered, can I, play something like bishop g2 and leave the knight here to get an extra pawn first? And then I considered also playing something like rook d8. And I didn't consider this for very long. Because it just looked terrible. But I don't know if I even looked at rook h3. I may have just given up right here. But I'm going to give up here again. I'm not going to double check that this is bad for black, because I probably looked a little bit further during the game. I tend to do that, and then you don't remember every single thing you looked at afterwards. So that extra option wasn't looking great. Then there was g takes f6, like I mentioned too. And for a moment, I was like, well, these g takes f6 structures do exist. They're a little bit unusual. It's not as obvious immediately what white's attacking plans are, right? Should he go for g5? Maybe then I can play f5. What does he do? I can sometimes play king h8 and rook g8. Maybe I could get counterplay, attack his king side. Depends, right? And then I thought, gosh, just queen e3. This move is super good because she'll just come to h6 and threaten checkmate. And then basically, I would want to defend that by playing rook g7. I can't do that fast enough. As soon as I play f5 to stop checkmate, then that opens knight g5 again. So basically, this looks like, this is an example of how I could insta-lose, right? I don't know. We can make some more moves that I didn't look at for argument's sake, and you'll see that black has lost. I don't know. Maybe there's like a slightly better defense for black, but this certainly, once I saw this queen e3, queen h6, I started realizing it was in trouble. Calculated a few moves, agreed with myself that it looked like really bad trouble. And started looking at bishop takes f6 again, knight to g5, and g6, and asking myself, is there any way I can survive this knight h7 thing? I mean, I also considered h5, bishop g5, hg6. Obviously, better to get that with the knight first, so I didn't look at that much. I also briefly asked myself, does he have moves other than knight h7 that might crush me here, like knight e4 or bishop e4 or taking on c5 or anything like that? And my answer was no. Like, taking on c5 improves my queen's defense a little bit. Knight e4, I can take on d4 with my bishop, and I'm good. So, I mean, he can try for an attack, certainly, but it's a very plausible position for me to survive. Not enough to be really scared. So I was mainly scared about knight h7. So let's go back to that. King h7, h5. And here, finally, I noticed another candidate move, which is king to g8. And, normally if you're sharp, I think you may more quickly come up with your list of candidate moves, king g7 and king g8. Instead of assuming that you need to defend this pawn that you can't even defend with your king, maybe you want to open up the second row for defense, right? Which allows queen g7, it allows rook f7, rook over. King g7 allows rook h8, so it's not like king g7 is all bad, right? But king g8 is obviously a candidate move. And, I might have been like 15 minutes into my think before that even occurred to me. Well, it was certainly a while. And then, I started looking at this. And, there's queen e6. There's also bishop here first. And that increases the threat of queen e6 check because they can't block with a piece now. The other thing that finally occurred to me was that with either king g7 or king h7, when white takes on g6, I don't necessarily have to take back, right? I could play, for argument's sake, I'm going to put a move on the board and just show you white taking on f7. That doesn't necessarily win for white to take on f7, right? Like, the game might continue. So that was an interesting realization that not every variation has to involve taking on g6, right? Maybe I can let white take on f7. It's scary to leave this pawn here for a while, but actually, I mean, it's certainly on the list of things you can do, and you're in a scary position no matter what. So you have to entertain scary variations. So those are like two critical elements that you could go to either square and that you could let them take on f7 and recapture with some piece versus taking on g6. And so that opened up a lot of extra variations for me to calculate at this critical point. But I'm going to point out that there's another candidate move for black that I never even considered, even though it's basically like a variation in the game, but in a different move order. Black can play rook to h8. This only occurred to me after the game. During the game, it never occurred to me. But this is a mix of the fact that you could go to either square and that you don't have to take back. So this allows a double check, which means I can't take back. But now I could go to one of these squares, right? If I'm content to let white take. And lo and behold, I can even take with the king instead of the queen here, maybe. Well, definitely, I could take either way in that position. Lo and behold, that wasn't that bad, right? We allowed a double check. Unthinkable. But it feels to me like white has 2 pawns for a piece and an exposed king, but no immediate raging attack. There's this many defenders and this many attackers, but this queen's not really in full position yet. So it's plausible that you can avoid any immediate assault here. So third candidate move, rook to h8, didn't even occur to me during the game. And you're just going to have those kind of blind spots at first. So there it is. You want to try and be extra flexible and like really capture all your critical candidate moves on the first 1 or 2 moves of these kind of variations, but you can't guarantee that you will, and you can't spend forever looking for them. So finally, I mean, king g8, it turns out is not as good as king g7, but I only realized that king g7 was okay after I'd calculated king g8 for a while and seen some of the extra ideas that it brought up. So let's move along with king to g7, and my opponent captured, and now I played the rook h8 move. Whoops, there it is, leaving this pawn on g6. Now, before we go on with that, I want to give you 1 or 2 little tactical puzzles here for fun. So let's say takes. So taking is bad because of check and mate, as I said before. But what about trying to keep the queen from coming to g4? Is that move any good for black? One of the critical things in determining the strength of an attack is often whose queen gets into the area first. Because once white plays queen to g4, you see my queen is really not able to get into this area of defense, right? And similarly, once black plays queen f4, it kind of blocks the white queen out from a bunch of the squares she might want to use. So, okay, what does white do in this position after queen f4? This is really a sweet little tactic. The answer is rook h7, forcing the king. And this is the only way to do it because, I mean, the only other route in for the queen is this, and you just play rook h8 for black, and black's like instantaneously winning. But rook h7 check, king g6, queen h5. This checkmate was a real bummer for me because it kept me from playing this queen f4 move, which would have been a sweet way to stall off white's attack. And if the king goes back to g8 instead, now there's this weakness here. And also checkmate. So that's a really sweet tactic for white. One of the big problems with allowing this bishop to g6 variation. I think I also considered here. Yeah. So making the trade, bringing white's bishop to g6 and then playing rook h8. That's making a path for the king to get out of queen g4, which I can't prevent, right? And it's trying to reduce some of his attack and material in general. So he plays queen g4, and then the variation was here, here, here. And at one point I was desperate enough that I was like, oh yeah, maybe I'll just go for this thing. For example, what I was kind of envisioning could happen was this discovered check, king moves over here, for example, take this, check here, take this, take here. Going into this endgame with queen and opposite colored bishops and down this past G pawn and the king weak. So there's a very good chance that white can win this with good play. I didn't know for sure in the game and, didn't really have the time to analyze it. I knew that this was a way to try and keep fighting if I was basically completely lost. That, I could force my opponent to play this position, that it wouldn't be like easy for him to win it, that he'd have to think about his moves and have time to make a mistake and give me a draw. But it was a pretty grim prospect. But when you're just searching for your options to, avoid getting checkmated, it's good to make a list of them like that. I knew that strategically it didn't make sense to play rook h1 because you're bringing this rook into the attack, which currently isn't. So it's kind of like giving white time. But on the other hand, what are you doing here in the meantime as black? So that kind of led to rook to h8, delaying this trade. Now, so white's follow-up here is basically going to have to be bringing the queen in. Taking on f7, it turns out, makes this position worse because your king just goes to a better square, defends this, gets out of the way of these checks, and basically black's plan here is some combination of queen f4, taking away squares from white's queen, and rook h1 followed by rook h8, trading off more material. Strategically, that's black's plan. An important piece of the plan that I kept, that I didn't super prioritize, is winning a pawn by taking on d4. It seems so horribly greedy, and everything else I listed sounds much more like your priorities. But taking on d4 is definitely a thought, and I'm greedy enough that I did want to do it if I got a chance, but I also actually undervalued how great it might be to grab that pawn. So we get here. So yeah, so he's basically going to have to go queen g4 because rook h7, his other move, takes, and now you've got a traitor pawn to hide behind with your king. And your king's perfectly safe, and you can kind of mop up. In fact, you don't even need to waste your time right away running there. Probably you can take the time to grab this pawn like you should, greedy style. And now black's winning if they can grab that pawn and then just tuck their king behind h7. So rook h7 is not a real move. Queen g4 is clearly the move. And here I thought a while about what I wanted to do. And the first string option was, again, trying to trade off the rooks. And this time, I'd calculated the following tactic. Check. The king can't go to f8 because you take here. So I had to go here, 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 queen h7, king here, here. Now we've got same colored bishops, and I'm down 2 pawns instead of 1. So this was a guaranteed loss. So again, I realized, sorry, I don't want to go too fast for y'all. This, you can calculate if he takes, and white's still up 2 pawns. So I think it's basically a guaranteed loss. Bishop g2, queen e5, check. And then king here, queen g7, check, and win the bishop. So once again, the idea of trading the rook on h1, it's just strategically bad. You're developing your opponent's extra piece and giving them time, and it's setting up a tactic for white. So once queen g4 is played, I felt like I had to deal with this threat. But the truth is, I actually don't have to deal with that threat yet. I mean, I would need to be in better position before trading on h1, but I don't actually have to deal with that threat. And I believe that after the game, I was looking and I thought this would have been the moment where I didn't play the greedy enough move, taking on d4. And then the thing is, this is not actually a crushing threat yet, because in this scenario, my pieces are all defended enough because I haven't brought this piece into the game. And I don't think I'm losing anything. Go here, 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 here. And the game goes on. And rook h7 is no threat as long as I can just take and hide the king here. So this is the point where I was like so obsessed with like, oh, I got to get all my pieces out, and I played rook g8. Got to get all my pieces out, coordinate them, defend the king, and like you should never like be like grabbing pawns. But mainly, I was just afraid when white didn't have a very specific tactical threat that I could see, even though I couldn't see it. I just had this general fear. That's kind of like the low confidence thing, right? I also didn't have tons of time. I had to keep the moves coming. So I played the safer looking move, rook g8, but actually it has some like weird tactical variations involved with it. So now white can play rook h7, and I can't take because pawn takes. Now there's something on g8. So the plan obviously had to be king here. And white pretty much had to go for something like this at this point, because now I've got another rook out. If he takes here, I take here. He's got no threats against my king, and I'm winning the pawn on g2 or d4 next move after he saves his queen, and everything's good for me. So yeah, so he definitely is forced into the rook h7 check, king f8, and now the first key tactical point is, what about rook f7 check? All right. Yeah, so takes. Here you have to make sure there's no fancy queen move to destroy you, but this is winning for black. This here, it's a very, very basic tactic that they can't play rook f7. But when you're rusty, each of these things takes a mental toll on you, right? That you have to like worry, what if I miss something? Like what if he does something else and then I allow that? Like you don't want to live on this kind of precipice when you're rusty. So this is all taking a toll on your confidence and keeping up your calculations. And in fact, white has two funky moves that you have to look at here. One is you always have to check this g7 move, because it attacks this, and if you ever take with the rook, you break the defense of h8. So you have to be able to take with the bishop, and then you need there not to be like a rook g7, rook h8 kind of tactic. So for example, if white's next move here, we're doubling rooks, right? You have to ask yourself, what are they threatening g7? And it's tricky, right? Blah here. So you have to take with the bishop, rook takes, and now luckily you can check here instead of taking back. But if you took back, then there'd be this and then this. So that's one move you've got to keep your eye on, is g7. And the other is a perhaps surprising deflection, queen to g3. Now, you would never expect white to trade queens here. So this is exactly the kind of move that can blindside someone who's rusty. And I definitely will admit that when I first went for this rook h8 idea, I had not seen the move queen to g3 coming. And I was planning to allow this rook into h7, and I had not seen this move coming. And, I was basically lucky that black still had a resource here. Because if you move your queen away along the second row, now white has the devastating queen b8 followed by rook f7. And if you take on g3, this is white's tactic, is he takes on f7 check before recapturing. King here, pawn takes. Now, this is attacked, and this is attacked. So here, your pieces are forked. Black's still down a couple pawns, including a strong pass pawn, and his king is in an awkward position, actually, where white's threatening to play things like bishop b5, king d8, pawn takes, c5, check. So that's what happens if you play bishop e7, the only move that saves both bishops temporarily. Then check, here, check, and black loses everything. Sorry, I don't want to go too fast again. look at this, appreciate that it is completely over. Oh yeah, I remember. I saw this move during the game, prolonging things by a little bit, and then you could take on b6 because that's a threat they'll have to take back. But basically, the move that you're playing is c4 to regain your piece, and this king is still in a troublesome shape. And this bishop's in danger of being lost. So, yeah, I remember. I mean, I was desperate. I was, when I first realized that this queen g3 move was coming, I was like checking variations all the way like this. Sometimes sometimes your opponent will have missed a tactic like bishop e7, bishop d5, avoiding losing a piece. And if he doesn't have c4, if he didn't have the c pawn, this might be like this genius solution that keeps you in the game, and then you win the endgame up a piece. Who knows? So you have to look for everything, even if it looks like you're just getting completely raked over the coals with all these horrible checks and all your pieces hanging and everything. If you're desperate and you've got the time, you look for all these candidate moves. But in fact, it's losing for black. And black only has one resource. You can see if you can guess it. All right. E5. Good job. Blocking queen takes c7. That's the only way. And interestingly, white could consider taking on e5 actually here. If white took on e5, what should black play? This is another puzzle for you. I'm getting you guys all warmed up for whatever games you play next by asking you a few puzzles here. This game is just full of really cool tactics. Queen e5 allows rook f7 check, right? And in fact, it just leads to checkmate when the king comes to e8 and bishop b5 and the rook's cutting off the d file. So queen e5 is not an option. Bishop e5 also was the wrong answer. After bishop e5, you allow the move g7. You've got it covered a million times, but you have to calculate this move all the time. Like I said, g7, if you take with the rook, you lose this one with check. Now you're down a rook and a pawn against the bishop while getting hammered. If you take with the bishop, then they just, whoops, what happened there? If you take with the bishop, then they just win the queen over here and checkmate you soon. So actually g7 just finishes it on the spot. You move your king, white makes a new queen. You don't have time to capture both. So you're losing. So actually you have to leave this pawn here. Don't take it. White is threatening to take on f6 though, because his queen is defended. So the pawn's not pinned to the queen. What you have to do is you have to take this rook. And if they take, you have this move. And here I actually, looked at this for a second. And my first instinct was to play like this move here. Because this rook is like basically trapped. And the concern is that if you play a random move, white's going to move the bishop and checkmate you on d8. So first I considered this, and then I realized takes, check, here, check. And white gets a draw. That was weird. You would think that in this position with an extra rook, black would somehow win the endgame, right? And then I considered here. And now there's bishop d4, bishop c4 threatening checkmate on d8. And that's pretty bad. So hang on. What did I figure out? I think I may have even miscalculated this. I may have finally thought that I could play fg6. And then when the bishop moves, just start getting my king out of things. No, what could I have possibly thought? Because this looks really bad. Maybe moving this rook? No, still seems to basically fall into checkmate. I wonder what I even had here's an idea. Maybe I had bishop c6, bishop e8. Was that my idea? Let's see if that works in the other scenario. So pawn takes g6, bishop c4, bishop c6, rook check, bishop blocks, bishop takes. Well, this is losing for black, I'm pretty sure. So that doesn't do it. Well, I don't even remember what I finally figured out that I wouldn't lose to this amazing like rook down endgame. I mean, I looked at it because I realized this was like serious, that like white could try and like win like this. I guess worst case, the rook g6 line is only a draw. If the bishop moves somewhere else, you can eliminate this pawn. So it pretty much has to take the rook. Now white's threatening mate in 1, and you have to take the bishop where you're down material, and that's a draw. Not the worst thing that could have happened to black, but I feel like I even had a way to come out ahead, but now I don't see it. So I don't know. You guys can see if you see an answer to it. But on the spot here, I'm not remembering any save for black in this position. Looks like white has the draw. Amazing, right? Totally amazing. Takes, takes. Queen's threatened. This is threatened. This is threatened. It's got to be this. I don't know. Calls for an original move, huh? Hard to find quickly. So, all right. So king here. I played e5. So let's continue on with the game, so this video doesn't take 2 hours. Here. Right. He plays now queen h3, getting out of rook takes h7. Which I figured at some point he was going to play queen h2 or queen h3, one of these kind of moves. So queen h3, and now basically forced to take it because this becomes a threat again. Takes here. So this pawn, I definitely knew it was going to tie down my piece in a way, so my material advantage is almost non-existent here. It's 2 pawns against a piece, and it's kind of like a rook trap, so not amazing, but I also knew that basically the dynamism was kind of gone here and my king was pretty safe. So yeah, queen h6, you can either block or play king e7, both are fine. So we get here, I think he took, and I considered e4 as well as taking back. It's very important to keep looking at all those, possible candidate moves. E4, the idea is it gets rid of the defense of h7, so you have more chance of, winning this pawn at some point and freeing your rook. And it also gives you queen to e5 as a kind of strong centralizing move. Because one of the things I was concerned about was, what if he comes in here and then his queen gets control of all this kind of space and I can't get my queen into that area anymore. So I looked at e4, completely forget what was good or bad about it. I think nothing was especially bad about it. I was just slightly concerned that I was basically letting him get into d7 before I was fully set up to defend it. After he plays something like this with some idea like here. Maybe I calculated a little something. Let's see if I did. I mean, there's this. Maybe bishop f7 even. I probably didn't have to take that with my king. It was probably not the best move. It was plausible. I forget. I think it was mostly just fear of like this and just sort of like wanting to get things controlled and thinking like, okay, I don't need to play e4. So I won't. So I played queen c5. And this gives me time when his bishop moves to cover d7 with my bishop. So it's just sort of like the simpler way to do it. And he played bishop f5 here. And again, I just played the simplest move, just taking that away. And now he controls the e4 move, as well as the queen f2 move by playing f3 here. And one of my missed chances in the game is that queen takes f2 is actually pretty strong here. But definitely not a tactic that I was likely to see low on time. The fear here is queen h6, right? And if you block, this is now checkmate. And if you move your king, the queen comes to f6, and that's also checkmate in a moment. And it defends the bishop, right? And king here should be the same, right? You just let the rook in, and then, you know, the same horrible fate happens to you. Oh, but wait. Back rank mate. And that's why queen f2 is good. And I mean, I knew he had the back rank. I was looking for it in various tactics. But the funny thing is, after check, you purposely come to e7, allowing rook d7 with check, winning both of your bishops and checkmating your king in a move. This move was so much like the kind of move you don't allow that I think I was blocking it out, on which you do. So queen f2 actually would be very, very strong here, because it wins an extra pawn, gets my queen into great position, starting to control stuff on the king side. Now he's got to babysit this, and he's got to babysit his first rank. And this becomes a source of counterplay, actually, this e-pawn advancing. So I think queen f2 was basically just winning here, but a tough thing to catch and calculate. I did try and calculate it, actually. I mean, I did calculate it. I didn't see to do this thing for some reason. That variation just didn't compute it properly, even though I looked at all the moves. So again, I played the safe move, bishop c6, just covering this, keeping things controlled. And now my opponent played f3. And now, you know, safe move was king e7, just coordinating my pieces better, getting out of queen h6 check. But I knew that the next move after f3 that he wanted to play was c3, blocking my other long diagonal, right? This is good placement of his pawns, by the way, against the bishops. I knew the next move he wanted to play was c3, and that would block out an opportunity that I had here to play queen b4. Now, queen b4 threatens e4 because of checkmate on b2. Very difficult to parry queen b2, actually. So if you want to stop that before it happens, you have to play c3 now, before that diagonal's open, and then there's bishop takes c3. And then I can play queen h4. And that traps his queen and goes to an endgame, which I think black can probably win. I didn't think too hard about it, but figured he could probably win. So I was like, ooh, do I want to pass up that opportunity by just slow playing it with king e7 and just being safe? This might be my chance to sort of like finish the game off. And I spent a couple minutes thinking about this move, and I calculated that there was sort of one key variation, bishop to e4. I also looked at queen h6 check, bishop e4. And then, you know, you want to take here. And if they take, you take back, and d7's open and stuff, but your queen's covering everything, and you're going to get rid of this pawn in a moment. Queen h6 check. You can defend the bishop, and she doesn't get over. This check first, king here, covered. Queen check, king here, pawn takes. There's this. King here, queen g4. Now you can actually save your bishop and block that check. So basically, everything winning for black. All right. So queen b4 it is. But what had I missed? Did anybody notice? Is anybody shouting at their screen right now about what I just blundered? Yeah, what I missed is that they can play bishop e4, exclam, and if you take, check, here, check, you can't block bishop g6 because you've now placed the queen on b4. And, you know, when I was calculating this whole thing, my queen was still on c5, and there weren't any of these fourth rank pin ideas. So, you know, it seemed like you could always take on e4 and have time to do it. So that is what I miscalculated. And that means black has to come back here because, okay, what about taking on h7? Rook h1 mate, right? So no recourse there. So you have to come back. and then check. If you come up, they can check you, and you have to go to the same square. And that would be a draw. So I was like, oh man, like I thought I was better. I thought like, you know, I had a chance to eventually outplay him and maybe try and win this game. So after bishop e4, I was like, huh. Okay, well, I can't let him just come into these squares. He's threatening queen c8 check as well as bishop takes c6. So queen c5. I thought it doesn't do it because of check, but actually you could block that, right? And your queen's defended. So maybe that was another option I didn't consider. But I was basically thinking bishop e8. That avoids him coming in here and avoids this. But then I realized that in this position, you know, black's not really better anymore. After giving up this diagonal and getting both of these pieces trapped here, I had to realize this position's not even that good for black anymore. White can kind of, you know, play check and g4, g5. I got quite scared by this position, for example. In the old days, I would just say like, oh, I can't take a repetition. I've got to win, and just play bishop e8 without really thinking about it, and low on time, and then just try and like blitz around. And that's why I lost a lot of games where I had an advantage and made a mistake, was by not taking the draw when the time came. This time I realized that my advantage was gone after blundering this check, check, check thing. So I did just take on e4. And the game ended in a draw by millionfold repetition. Okay, so that's the game for today. I left it in very, very high spirits, actually, because it was lots of fun. I got to calculate like all these crazy variations, and I got some of them right. And I wasn't tired at the end of the game, which was cool, because you know, often you won't have that kind of stamina for a more serious chess game, because it's not the kind of thing that you do in your normal life. Certainly not me in the last year. So it was just like refreshing and fun and exciting to play a game like that. And hopefully that's one big step towards getting rid of the rust. The other piece of information for anyone trying to deal with like rust and thinking, how does it go, is it really only takes about like 3 to 4 games to knock off most of the rust and start like calibrating. Like you won't have all the details. If you're like an IM or a GM and you're playing at a high professional level, you won't have some of the time management stuff for a long while because it's very fine-tuned for you. But for the average player, you'll get a lot of your calculation and confidence back within 3 to 4 games and start calculating pretty normally. So one of the main advices for anyone who's concerned about being rusty, I mean, I've given some techniques for trying to play better while rusty, but one of the main things you could do is just play 3 or 4 bad games and you'll recalibrate and you won't be rusty anymore. That's better than delaying a tournament because you're afraid you're rusty and trying to study your way back into shape, because the main problems that you have are not things that you're likely to study your way back into. The only real way would be to like play a practice tournament game with a friend instead of playing in an actual tournament. Would simulate the thing and sort of get you moving in the right direction. But basically, I think you should just throw yourself back into the fire, play a couple bad games, whatever. People going to talk, people going to hate, and then you know, a few games later, you'll be back to your own brilliant self, or Potzer self, depending on how good or bad you are at the game and how you see yourself. But yeah, for anyone out there thinking about getting back in, it felt good for me. It'll probably feel good for you. And it was also fun doing a video again after so long. That kind of worked out, hopefully. So hope you enjoyed it. Got any comments, got any questions? I will answer them in the comment section. If you've got any video requests, maybe I'll make another video. So go ahead and give me the topic you want covered. All right, that's all for now.